What is the Churchill 21st Century Leadership Programme, and why Churchill? We are witnessing a crisis of leadership, both nationally and internationally, across most sectors.
The leadership point that emerged from the panel, and very strongly from the interviews that I did for the piece Nigel mentioned, which was with 7 of the Churchill Leadership Fellows who are learning about leadership and talking about leadership, people in their 20s who are future leaders, was very strongly of change in the way in which leadership is carried out. The conclusion I drew from my interviews with the 20-somethings was that in 3 key areas things were going to change. Influence trumps power and position, networks trump hierarchies, and intelligence in its broadest sense trumps force in the future of leadership.
Do we have the will to lead? Secondly, and for me the most important, is about the will to learn. And I think it connects with the point around, intelligence versus force, networks versus hierarchy. The technology relearning and that new ecosystem of leadership constructs is hugely important.
Change is the single most important challenge that I face in my ability to lead, and seeing change as my job. Will to lead is being prepared to fail, essentially, and not just prepared to fail, but accepting that at times you will have to fail in order to get it right. And I think that's just not for everybody. We fundamentally believe it will make us a better business if we're able to be a more diverse employer. And I hear a lot of people talk about a lack of talent, but I'm not sure that that's really the right way to look at it. I actually think there's a lack of opportunities for people, not necessarily a lack of talent.
One of the things I honed in on was the what and the how. And I think we're finding that increasingly important in the way that we run ACCA, particularly the how. So we've set ourselves a very ambitious strategy, and we realise the only way to achieve that strategy is actually by concentrating on that cultural shift and the behaviours that you need in order to achieve it. I've always been very keen, since I took over as Chief Executive, which was 2008, talking about leadership at all levels. I think that goes back to Chris's point about opportunity. Everybody actually does have the opportunity to display leadership. But it needs to be recognised, it needs to be encouraged, and people need the space in order to do that. So I think there was a lot in the report that spoke to the how and how that can be implemented or taken forward by leaders.
Churchill has a great quote, which is, "I'm always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught," which is great because it fits really into our kind of pedagogy, which is learn by doing. And just in terms of, I think, the challenges, if you look at what technology is doing to society as a whole, an example I always like is, so Uber really wants to launch their driverless car. When that happens, 700,000 people in the UK overnight will be made unemployed. So I think that's a really interesting, fundamentally social thing that requires a lot of leadership. Leadership really is being completely redefined. When you look at the way that Churchill was leading, it was constantly adapting and he was constantly learning. And I think that learning, and all the panelists have really mentioned it today, is something that's so key to actually deal with the change that's been mentioned and everything, but also to work out where the core of the vision and the belief is about what you're doing.
Do you think, Ollie, that I tend to have a slightly cynical journalist view that quite a lot of business managers are essentially coping day to day. They're just trying to keep their heads above water, and this may go for leaders as well. We'll perhaps talk about this. Is that something that will ultimately overwhelm the new leaders, the next generation of leaders? And if so, how do you try and avoid that happening?
Definitely, I think for sure. So I think one of a question I really like, there's a panel, Churchill panel, a few months ago, and someone said about Twitter, like it's impossible to have a social media strategy because it moves too quickly. And I was sort of like, well, yeah, just you need to have a strategy that responds quickly. There's a huge fear of failure, which is something that, particularly again, if you look at Churchill's leadership, actually, you can't be too afraid of failing, otherwise you're never going to make a lot of those incredibly risky decisions. And it tends to be the most successful kind of both next generation leaders, but also leaders, and I think say Paul Polman of Unilever, for example, is a great example of that. Actually putting his neck out and saying, we really believe in sustainability, having metrics around it, opening up all of their challenges, actually not just saying they're doing this stuff, but fundamentally doing it.
We've always talked about leadership, stewardship and governance as the heart of business success, but we're understanding how leadership needs to change in the light of the fact organizations aren't going to be so big, they're going to have to be more entrepreneurial, they're going to have to be much more adaptive. Let's not throw out our appreciation of history just because we have to learn to be incredibly adaptive for the future. It may or may not still be relevant that in Japan there are 20,000 companies which have managed to live more than 100 years, and there are even 5 which have managed to live more than 1,000 years. And I won't bore you now with the characteristics that they have in common, but they're characteristics that are quite often talked about in tomorrow's company.
It's a contradiction, really, isn't it? Because in a lot of respects, technology is cited as being the thing that will open up, because people can take a smartphone in and use social media.
Completely, and actually, I think completely. But I think one of the big challenges, and I definitely believe that technology is one of the biggest potential emancipators. If you think of what, for example, even something like Duolingo can do, you can learn any language, you can learn anything. And I went to the Philippines recently and thought this. I went to the Philippines and was like, just imagine if everyone had an iPad and could teach themselves wherever you go. Many people there have iPads, but they're not teaching themselves stuff. And actually what I was kind of made aware of was actually this new level of poverty, which is poverty of aspiration, as opposed to actually poverty of being able to have access to that stuff.
We should not, I think about technology in a purely disruptive sense. It is emancipating and opening up of whole areas.
And how do you apply, to go to the trust point, how do you ensure through your leadership that this technology helps to reinforce trust in business and in leadership rather than destroy it?
I think there are 3 elements to that. The first is, in the case of Watson is only capable of digesting, processing, and reasoning with the data that we give it. The second is that, you need to partner with companies who have track records of protecting data.
Clearly, if you don't give individuals the opportunity, as a number of people have mentioned, to potentially fail as well, they don't make a bold step that is then that has them cut off at the knees, you might simply revert to a type of command and control leadership that perhaps is not as valuable as it used to be. You'd be actually not allowing people to take the risks and take the opportunities that they're given.
By definition, you cannot create change unless you make mistakes. I mean, it is impossible.
Do you think but do you think that's more difficult for politicians than it is for business leaders?
I think that my personal view is it is even less forgiving for politicians than it is for business leaders, because you can, for example, I think it is possible as a business leader to change your mind. It is possible to say, actually, I thought that this was the right thing to do, but we've tried that for a bit, but now we're going to go and try that. That's what entrepreneurs do all the time, and yet it is extremely difficult for a politician to even change their mind.
The issue around failure is a huge issue. I had the pleasure to teach at Harvard on a couple of almost entirely female programs, young women between sort of 20 and 35. And the risk of failure in terms of living in a social media world where everyone knows everything about them, the risk of failure that they be too creative or push the boundaries of some form of regulation, they were there from all over the world, was extremely surprising to me. I think whether you're a small company, a medium-sized company, or a very large company, what I took from this report is be asking yourself, how are you essential to your clients? What is it that differentiates you? And if you're not, then do some reinvention. What's the worst that could happen? You might get to the right place faster.
Being organisationally, socially, culturally able to accept that failure doesn't just happen, but failure is essential in order to succeed.
Trying to bridge that gap between business and society and to use the leadership that is generated through business for the betterment of society could be a tremendous step from this report, which could impact the political as well as the business environment.
In the end, it is all about relationships. It is all about human beings, even in a time of change. and let's just try and keep our sense of historical perspective while we do so.
That point is very well made. We are, of course, sitting in the centre of the global capital of short-term memory loss, the City of London. So let's hope that resonates out beyond this room.